When I was 10, I learned that I was adopted. Since I never knew much about my family or their history, I decided to do some research on my own in my 20s, without my adoptive parents knowing. I thought I was wise and smart enough to handle whatever I might discover about my birth parents, who they were, where they came from, and most importantly, why they left me. Going through public records was a Sisyphean task, one that would take me years of digging through paperwork. But in one of the documents I was reviewing, I found some information about my birth mother's mother, my grandma. I learned when she had passed and where she was buried, so I decided to visit the cemetery to research my family history instead of sifting through endless files. I assumed this would give me the answers I was seeking, and I never imagined I would end up confronting my worst nightmares. Since I was working after college at the time, the only moments I had to visit the graveyard were in the evenings. Although the idea of wandering a graveyard at night didn't seem like a particularly good idea, I figured nothing could happen. After all, the dead are dead, and I wasn't really a believer in ghosts or the paranormal. It was a Sunday evening when I'd just finished my shift at the store. The sky was overcast, and a biting chill clung to the air as I stepped out. I headed straight to the graveyard without stopping home to change into more comfortable clothes. As I approached the ancient iron gate, an eerie feeling washed over me. Something inexplicable for someone who doesn't believe in ghosts or fairy tales. Every footstep on the damp, uneven ground sent shudders up my spine, and I couldn't shake the sensation of unseen eyes tracking my every move. Wandering among weathered tombstones, each bearing the scars of time, I felt a growing sense of foreboding. My heart pounded relentlessly in the silence, while my breath came out in ragged, visible puffs in the cold night air. Then I found it, a moss-covered crypt hidden behind a veil of tangled ivy. The stone door, smoothed by years of neglect, seemed to whisper secrets of the past, beckoning me closer with a mix of dread and irresistible curiosity. My hands trembled as I reached out to push the door open. It creaked ominously, a sound that resonated like a ghostly lament through the stillness. Beyond the threshold lay a narrow, spiraling staircase descending into utter darkness. Every step felt like a plunge into another realm, a realm where time slowed and the boundary between the living and the dead blurred. The deeper I went, the more oppressive the darkness became. I could feel the cold, clammy air pressing in, seeping into my bones. With each step, a strange, rhythmic pulse began echoing through the stone walls, a deep, almost hypnotic beat that seemed to emanate from the very heart of the earth. I felt as if the ground beneath me were alive, throbbing with a hidden, malevolent force. At the bottom of the staircase, I entered a chamber that felt frozen in time. Dust-covered walls were adorned with cryptic carvings that flickered in and out of my vision, as if moving with a life of their own. I pressed my ear against the cool stone, straining to decipher the relentless pulse. It was like a distant drum, each beat synchronized with my quickening heartbeat. I could feel my skin crawl as the sound reverberated through me, sparking a surge of primal fear. In that suffocating silence, every nerve in my body screamed to flee, yet a morbid fascination held me in place. I became hyper-aware of every sound, the scuffle of my own footsteps, the ragged rhythm of my breathing, and that inexorable pulse that drew me deeper into the mystery of the crypt. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead as my thoughts raced wildly. What ancient secret did this hidden chamber guard? Had I awakened something that should have remained undisturbed? Then, In a moment that still haunts me, I caught a glimpse of a shadow flitting just beyond the reach of my light. I spun around, my heart in my throat, but the darkness swallowed the fleeting movement. The ensuing silence was more terrifying than any sound, a silence that promised retribution for my intrusion. At that very instant, I noticed a faded photograph tucked into a corner of the chamber. It was a portrait of an elderly woman, her eyes heavy with sorrow and mystery. The shadow I'd just seen bore an uncanny resemblance to her, as if her restless spirit had reached out from the depths of that forgotten crypt to warn me away. I bolted up the staircase as if my very life depended on it, the echo of that eerie, relentless beat chasing me all the way out. Once back under the cold, indifferent night sky, I could hardly catch my breath. The memory of that underground chamber, with its oppressive darkness and inexplicable pulse, is etched into my mind like a nightmare I can never truly wake from. Ever since that night, I've carried a deep, unsettling realization that some secrets are meant to remain buried. That dreadful descent into the crypt left me questioning the fragile boundary between the living and the dead. Even now, I find myself haunted by the thought, what truly lies beneath our forgotten graveyards, and what dark force did I disturb in that silent, subterranean chamber? It wasn't until later, when I finally met my birth mother, that I discovered who the woman in the picture was. My grandmother. Now, the nagging feeling that she tried to warn me about something still won't let me rest. Was there something darker in there she was trying to protect me from? Or was she the very threat she sought to shield me from? I guess I'll never find out. So, like 3 weeks after my dad passed, I just couldn't shake this feeling. You know how sometimes you just feel pulled to go somewhere? That's what happened one evening, this chilly, gloomy day. I ended up at the cemetery by his grave. I just needed to be alone with my thoughts, to remember him, and honestly, I was hoping to find some kind of peace. As I'm kneeling there by his headstone, just sitting with the quiet, I hear this weird sound, like a low murmur. At first, I brush it off, thinking it's just the wind or something. But it wasn't, you know. It was like soft voices mixed with the sound of footsteps on wet ground. Totally strange. I should have just stayed put, but I couldn't help myself. I was curious, but there was this weird sense of dread too. I got up and followed the sound, away from where my dad's buried. I walked through the older part of the cemetery, where the tombstones are all cracked and moss-covered, and I came to this little clearing. The moon was out, but it was dim, just enough light to make out 3 men standing in a circle. They were wearing these dark hoods, like something straight out of a creepy movie, and they were chanting, low, deep, and rhythmic, like they were performing some sort of ritual around this crude stone altar that had these symbols on it. I couldn't make heads or tails of them. My heart was pounding, but I stepped forward, my voice probably braver than I felt. "What are you doing here?" I asked, not really expecting an answer. They all stopped chanting and turned toward me, but I couldn't see their faces, just shadows. For a long, uncomfortable moment, none of us moved. The air was heavy, like even the night was waiting for what would happen next. Finally, the one in the middle speaks. His voice was calm, almost too calm, but there was something off about it, like regret, or maybe something darker. He says, "We honor the boundary between life and death. Your father's spirit carries a power we need to awaken. That sent a chill right down my spine. My dad? He was just a normal, kind man. Nothing about him seemed mystical or powerful. I was pissed and sad all at once. My fists clenched, and I could barely get the words out. "He's at peace," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You have no right to use his grave for whatever this is." The other two guys glanced at each other, and for a second, I saw the eyes of the leader under his hood. There was something in his look, pity maybe, or some kind of determination. We just stood there in this tense silence, like we were all trying to figure out what would happen next. Then, as if they came to some unspoken agreement, they slowly backed away. They disappeared into the shadows like they were never there. But right before the leader was fully gone, he whispered something that stuck with me. "The ties that bind us to the past run deep, and tonight, you've been drawn into forces beyond your understanding." I was left standing there, my mind racing. The cemetery suddenly quiet again. It was like nothing had happened, but it left me shaken. I walked back to my dad's grave, trying to process what I'd just seen. It made me wonder if the line between life and death is really as clear as we think it is. There was something dark and unsettling in that ritual, something I wasn't sure I wanted to understand. That night, I sat by my dad's headstone, and I knew one thing for sure. Whatever those men were trying to do, I wasn't going to let them use his memory for it. So, 2 weeks later, things started to get real weird. I'd been thinking about what that guy said, the whole ties that bind us to the past thing. It kept replaying in my mind like a broken record, but I tried to brush it off, you know. I figured it was just some creepy encounter, and maybe I'd imagined half of it anyway. But I should have known better. It all started when I noticed little things around my house, stuff being moved. I'd walk into a room and swear something wasn't where I left it. At first, I thought I was just scatterbrained, grief messing with me. But then it got worse. One night, I heard knocking, not on the door or windows, but inside the walls. A slow, deliberate knock, like someone was trying to get my attention. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but that sense of dread was back, stronger than ever. And then came the dreams. Every night for a week, I'd find myself back at my dad's grave, but it wasn't peaceful anymore. The sky was always dark, the air thick with something I couldn't describe. And there were those men again, chanting, their faces hidden in shadow. But this time, I was part of it. I was in the circle. Their words wrapped around me like chains, pulling me deeper into something I couldn't escape. One night, after one of those dreams, I woke up with my dad's old watch in my hand. It had been buried with him. There's no way I should have had it, but there it was, the cold metal biting into my palm like it had never left the grave. That's when I knew. Those men, the ritual, everything, they weren't done. And somehow, neither was my dad. The ties to the past that guy had talked about, they weren't just words. I had been pulled into something I didn't understand, something much older and darker than I ever imagined. I went back to the cemetery that day. It wasn't a choice. It felt like something was pulling me, just like before. When I got there, the air felt heavy, like it had the night I first saw those men. As I walked toward my dad's grave, I noticed something off. The earth around his headstone looked disturbed, like someone had been there recently. I stood there, heart pounding, and then I heard it again, the chanting. I turned around, and there they were, the same 3 men, standing in the same circle. But this time, it felt different. The leader spoke, his voice carrying through the still air. "The ties that bind us to the past run deep," he said, just like before. "You've been drawn into forces beyond your understanding, but now you must choose." Choose? Choose what? I didn't understand, but I could feel it in my gut. Whatever they were doing, it wasn't over. They needed something from me, something connected to my dad. I wanted to run, to get out of there, but my legs wouldn't move. It was like the ground itself was holding me in place. The leader stepped closer, pulling back his hood just enough for me to see his face. Weathered, ancient, like he'd seen more than any living person should. "Your father's spirit is tied to this place, to us," he said, "and now, so are you." I didn't know what to say. The words stuck in my throat. All I could think about was getting my dad out of whatever this was. "He's at peace," I managed to say, my voice shaking, but the man shook his head slowly. "There is no peace without understanding," he said. "You cannot undo the past, but you can choose to honor it or fight it. Either way, the ties remain." And just like that, they were gone again, vanishing into the shadows like they always did, leaving me with a choice I didn't fully understand. But one thing was clear. I was connected to something bigger now, something ancient, and whether I liked it or not, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The boundary between life and death wasn't as clear as I thought, and those men, they were proof. Whatever they wanted, it wasn't over. And as much as I wanted to protect my dad's memory, I realized I might need to face whatever this was head on. Because if I didn't, the past, those ties, were just going to keep pulling me deeper until I had no choice left at all. So I met this guy online. Normal enough, right? His name was Mark. He seemed nice, kind of quiet, but sweet. We'd been chatting for a couple of weeks before we finally decided to meet in person. Dinner was casual, nothing fancy, but something about him had this strange, almost unsettling vibe. It wasn't anything obvious, just little things. His eyes lingered too long, or the way he'd go quiet for stretches of time. I kept brushing it off, telling myself I was overthinking it. After dinner, he offered to drive me home. I hesitated for a second, but he smiled, soft, not creepy or anything, and I figured, why not? I'd gotten this far, and he'd been a perfect gentleman all night. But as soon as we got in his car, I noticed he wasn't heading toward my place. Instead, we were driving out of town, past the familiar streets, into areas I didn't know too well. I tried to play it cool. "This isn't the way to my place," I said, laughing a little like it was no big deal. Mark didn't look at me. He just kept driving, his hands tight on the wheel. "I want to show you something," he said, his voice calm but with an edge to it that made my skin crawl. I didn't know what to say. I should have insisted he turn around, but there was something about his tone that made me curious. Or maybe I was just too polite, too afraid to cause a scene. Either way, I stayed quiet, my unease growing with every mile we drove deeper into nowhere. Finally, the car slowed, and my stomach dropped when I realized where we were. A cemetery, a big old one, with wrought iron gates and headstones that looked like they'd been there forever. The moon was out, casting long shadows across the ground, and everything about the place screamed wrong. "Why are we here?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. Mark parked the car and turned to me, his expression unreadable. "There's something I need you to see," he said. My heart was pounding now, every instinct telling me to run, but his eyes, they weren't menacing, just sad, almost desperate. Against my better judgment, I followed him as he got out of the car and walked through the gates. The cemetery was eerily quiet, the only sound our footsteps on the gravel path. I trailed behind him, my pulse quickening with every step. This wasn't right. This wasn't normal. "Mark, seriously, what is this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, but the fear was starting to seep through. He didn't answer. He just kept walking, leading me deeper into the graveyard. I considered turning back, running for it, but something kept me rooted to the spot. Curiosity? Stubbornness? I wasn't sure. Finally, we reached a small, isolated section, away from the main rows of graves. Mark stopped in front of a headstone, its inscription worn and barely legible. He stood there for a moment, silent, his shoulders hunched like he was carrying something heavy. Then, without looking at me, he said, "This is my wife's grave." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. "What?" I asked, barely able to process what he'd just said. He turned to face me, and in the dim light, I could see the pain etched across his face. "She died 3 years ago," he said softly. "I bring people here sometimes, to see her, to remember her." My mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything. All this, the eerie drive, the silence, the strange vibe. It wasn't about me. It wasn't about anything sinister. He just wanted me to see this, to share this piece of his life with me. But the way he'd done it, dragging me to this lonely, forgotten graveyard in the middle of the night, it was wrong. It felt wrong. I don't understand," I stammered, taking a step back. "Why didn't you just tell me?" Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Because no one ever understands. They think I'm crazy or obsessed. But I need people to see her. I need them to know she was real." I didn't know what to say. My fear was still there, humming just beneath the surface, but now it was mixed with something else. Pity, maybe, or sadness. I glanced at the grave, the name barely visible in the moonlight, and suddenly felt like an intruder in someone else's grief. "I'm sorry," I whispered, though I wasn't even sure what I was apologizing for. Mark just nodded, his eyes distant. "You can go if you want," he said quietly. "I'll take you home." I wanted to run, to get as far away from that place as possible, but I stayed for a few more minutes, standing in awkward silence as Mark stared at the headstone. Finally, he turned and led me back to the car. The drive home was quiet, no words exchanged, and when we reached my apartment, he didn't say goodbye. He just gave me a sad, distant look before driving off into the night. As I lay in bed that night, the whole thing replayed in my mind over and over. I still felt shaken, like I'd been part of something I shouldn't have. And I couldn't help but wonder if Mark would ever really let go, or if he was forever bound to the past, to a graveyard in the middle of nowhere, with no one left to understand. It left me with a feeling I couldn't shake, that sometimes the dead aren't the ones who haunt us. Sometimes it's the living who carry the ghosts.